So as you know, this panel is called How Can Stories, Histories, Art, and Music Help Comprehend a Planet in Crisis? We're basically four distinct people coming from different disciplines who are trying to talk about music, art, history, storytelling, and how we think about it in our work, or how we think our disciplines might be able to contribute to a wider discussion on the climate crisis. I'm going to just quickly introduce us. So who you just heard was Professor Amanda Parr, who's Associate Professor of History and Fellow of St. Catherine's College. We have Professor Fiona Stafford, who's Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Somerville College. She's going to be our first speaker. And then we have Professor Dan Grimley, who's Professor of Music, Fellow of Merton College, and is currently the interim head of the Humanities Division. I'm Nenika Mathur. I'm an Associate Professor in Anthropology and South Asian Studies, and along with Amanda, I co-direct the Climate Crisis Thinking in the Humanities and Social Sciences Research Network at Torch and the Oxford Martin School. So, as you know, we're coming together today to collectively think about how stories, histories, art, and music can help with the complex but necessary process of understanding and reimagining the planetary crisis. As Amanda said, this panel discussion is being recorded, so we're going to begin with just us offering out some opening thoughts on how we approach history, art, music, stories, and then we very, very much hope to make this a much more collaborative, conversational discussion. So I'll be taking the mic around if you have any questions.
Thank you, Nyanika and Amanda, and thank you everybody for turning up on a Friday afternoon. I'm going to talk briefly about how older stories, poems, works of art can emerge freshly in the light of our current crisis and may have much to offer going forward. In so much modern discourse, the focus is on contemporary voices, the relevance to us, as it's sometimes presented. And this isn't at all surprising. We can't really know what it was like to be alive in centuries past, nor what it might be like in the distant future. We have a wealth of records and also predictions, often brilliantly modelled on extensive data, but neither can really tell us what it felt like or what it will feel like to be walking the earth in a different time from our own. And yet this is exactly what the climate crisis demands. In order to grapple with the challenge of a future very different from the present, most people need to imagine how they might think or feel in that unfamiliar time. And because it seems an unprecedented problem, we're at a bit of a loss to know how to prepare. Whether we should be preparing for a very new lived experience, or doing our best to avert changes and maintaining the existence we have. And because it's a global predicament, it's very difficult to know whether anticipations by individuals in Britain or Germany or Brazil or the Seychelles, Greenland or Nepal would bear any relation to each other. The very awareness of the diverse ways in which climate change affects people in different regions and countries can make it seem almost impossible to arrive at a future that might satisfy everyone. People may agree on wanting a better future for their children or their friends' children or everyone's children's children, but the specifics of that future and how to achieve them are inevitably going to prompt competing as well as concurring visions, or perhaps nothing very clear at all. What we do have are earlier stories and responses to a planet damaged and in desperate need of repair. Stories that have emerged and merged in different parts of the world and which can still speak to us, surprise us, perhaps offer hope and guidance. Stories often offer illuminating examples of difficult situations and reactions, of different choices and outcomes. They don't tell us how to live or what to do, but they help us think through crises, to weigh up the consequences of the choices on offer, to experience events and emotions through characters often very different from ourselves, sometimes surprisingly similar. Through film or theatre, we can see contrasting reactions to huge storms or floods or droughts that we may not have experienced personally, but can imagine with the help of creative artists. Through novels, we can see a whole cast of varied characters with different values, experiencing events, making their choices, feeling the consequences of their choices, seeing their effects on others. Through poems and songs, we can find messy, complicated experience, emotions, thoughts, distilled into memorable words and images and ready to be shared. And as the prospect of catastrophic climate change as a result of human agency is widely perceived as an unprecedented state of affairs and therefore very difficult to imagine accurately, perhaps we can learn something from some of the earlier generations who saw the globe in terms of a grand ruin. And I'm going to take an example, just one example from English literature, as that's my subject area, the great epic poem of the English language, John Milton's Paradise Lost, which may initially appear to be very backward-looking in that it takes us back before the beginning of the human race to the very creation of the earth. For Milton, as a 17th century Christian poet, this meant rewriting the ancient biblical story of Adam and Eve. But although Paradise Lost is very much of its time in many ways, it's also remarkably forward-looking in its meditation on how the earth began in a perfect state and then was ruined by human actions. Milton follows the basic story from Genesis, but gives a great deal of time and thought to why the first human beings, when living in a beautiful paradise with everything they need, should willfully engage in actions that ruined their perfect world. The story follows the biblical line that humans are tempted into disobedience to God, but by dramatising Adam and Eve and making them a sympathetic, mutually devoted couple, Milton suggests that the fall happens partly because they're overambitious and aspiring, easily led, but also because they don't understand the full consequences of what they were doing. Interestingly, the way in which the effects of human wrongdoing are depicted in the poem include extreme climate events and the distress of the natural world. Man's grave error makes the earth itself feel the wound. Nature from her seat, sighing through all her works, gave signs of woe. She trembles from her entrails and groans, and then tilts on her axis, producing extreme weather everywhere. Milton's very attentive, too, to the impact on the non-human life of the planet, how the animals and birds and fish immediately begin to behave differently, competing for food and territory, and regarding human beings as enemies rather than fellow creatures or carers. It's a remarkably vivid imagining of the whole planet animated and suffering as a direct consequence of humans' misguided actions. So it's just as much a fable for the 21st century as it was for any previous century, not to be read literally, but figuratively. Interestingly, during the 18th century, as the Industrial Revolution got underway, a period often seen as the start of the Anthropocene, many writers began to pick up on the poem's concern for the natural well-being of the world, echoing Milton's epic as they sought to recover paradise, to question the new factories, polluted cities, exploitative work practices, child labour, animal cruelty, and the destruction of older, more sustainable communities and ways of life. What might also be helpful about all this is that because the perception of climate change is unprecedented, sometimes seems to paralyse people with anxiety, older stories and poems can offer great insight into the psychological responses to cataclysmic change and ways of confronting the experience. By focusing on distinct characters, Milton allows us to see the first humans in the world reacting to what they've done in very human ways. After initially feeling very excited and drunk with power, they start blaming each other. They become angry and divided, and then gradually more apologetic, forgiving, humble, ready to change their ways. It's a poem of profound loss and damage, but also of recovery. Adam's shown the consequence of their actions, horrified as the future of the world unfolds before his eyes. As this is a Christian poem, the arrival of Christ as a redemptive figure is crucial. But what may speak more to many modern readers is the way Adam gains insight into how he and his descendants might behave in future. They have to learn to live well, follow the rule of not too much, then add virtue, patience, temperance, and love, the soul of all the rest. Now, my rather simplified paraphrase of this very complicated poem makes it all sound like a very old-fashioned morality tale, which in many ways it is. But because Milton pays so much attention to Adam's fluctuating, painful reactions to seeing the future of the earth he's ruined, it's also a very compelling human story. It makes you feel and think, what would I have done? What should I do? There's much to challenge in Milton's poem, much that a modern audience may find alienating. But as an effort to imagine how humans ruin the Earth without really meaning to, and then how they react to the realisation that this is what they've done, it offers a great deal of thought-provoking material, as well as stunning poetry. Milton's epic emerged from a period of tremendous turbulence. He was right at the heart of the government in the aftermath of the Civil War. He was then plunged into political exile when the monarchy was restored. He was left afterwards to meditate the ruins of his own anticipated future as the Great Plague carried off thousands of his contemporaries. And he was also confined by his own profound physical blindness. So this is not a poem written by someone out of touch with the world, but by one who has seen the operations and struggles of power at close hand, and who, despite his emphasis, persistent emphasis on humility, still had the creative audacity to tell the story of the planet from the very beginning. Like many stories, it's old, but not outdated. And like many old stories, it's well worth attending to in our current crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was absolutely beautiful, and a beautiful way to sort of begin this panel. I'm also going to be talking about stories, but of a slightly different form. As I said, I'm an anthropologist, and the stories I'm going to talk about very briefly are coming from a region in India that I've been working in now for the past 15 years. This is a small state in northern India, which is called Uttarakhand. It's primarily a Himalayan state. It has a long border with Tibet and with Nepal. And I've been working there since 2006, when I started my PhD fieldwork. Now, this region is completely, at this point, defined by climate disasters of different forms, what we call climate disasters. So glacial bursts, extinction of species, deforestation, you name it. There is a way in which, even in the last 15 years, I can see that there's a whole new narrative that has come to define this region. It's a very ecologically sensitive zone, which is, even as we speak right now, witnessing the highest rainfall that it ever has had in recorded history since the mid-19th century, when rainfall was first sort of recorded in this region. There is also sort of a long history of environmental struggle in this place. So some of you might be aware of something called the Chipko Movement, which was an environmental movement in the 1970s, when women and other, well, primarily women, would go and sort of literally hug trees in order to stop them from being commercially felled. This is where the phrase tree hugger comes from the word Chipko, which literally means to hug. But the stories I want to tell today are slightly different from sort of the standard narratives that we might get. The standard narratives that we get on climate disasters or climate crisis or even environmental change in this area are either in the language of a particular kind of legitimized science, which talks about glacial breaches and which talks about hydroelectric power, and it talks about it talks about climate change in a language and a narrative that we might be quite familiar with from, say, reading The Guardian or reading Science and Nature, the journals. But the stories I want to talk about today are slightly different. And the reason I want to sort of talk about them today is for two reasons. One is that I think these stories tell us that the climate crisis is very real. It's very much here, that people are actually living with the very, very harmful effects of climate change on an everyday basis. It takes it away from a particular popular narrative, largely in the English language, largely through particular kinds of terms that we understand. But it also sort of makes more, to my mind, perhaps makes us a bit more aware of the everyday nature of this moment in time, of a planet in crisis, and what that might mean, what that looks like, and different ways of experiencing it. So the way I want to talk about it, also a bit like Milton, is actually through a focus on the non-human, and specifically looking at animals and human beings' changing relationship with animals. The animal I'm going to be talking about today are like big cats, so primarily tigers and leopards. This region of India, again, has a very, very dense population of leopards in particular, but also tigers. As you all know, these are highly endangered animals, tigers on the sort of verge of extinction. And the kind of narrative we have about them is also one which is about conservation and preservation. But that's not the narrative I want to talk about here. I want to talk about big cats that become predatory, that sort of actively prey on humans, come and attack them, kill them, eat them. And I want to talk about these narratives not, again, in a very familiar trope which comes from particular colonial representations of India as a space that is populated with man-eating tigers. Probably the most famous account of predatory big cats from South Asia is that written by Jim Corbett, who again some of you might know, who was a hunter-turned-conservationist. He was a colonial official in this region, and he wrote, these best-selling accounts of attacks, of him hunting down what are called man-eaters. I want to talk about the stories that I have heard over the last 15 years by long-term residents of the Himalaya who also talk about these big cats, but I say that they don't talk about it through either the narrative of preservation, though they're very much for conserving them, but this is not the language that they adopt. Neither is it at all the colonial or even the post-colonial states narrative of protecting citizens from these evil beasts. It's a very different way of understanding them. I'm not going to have time to go into the texture of the stories right now, but what I do want to say in sort of the next few minutes is talk about three aspects of what these stories tell us and why they might be worth listening to. So the first thing, as I said, is that they bring, to my mind, alive the everydayness of the climate crisis. It's away from these spectacular events. It's away from a dam bursting and flash floods happening, because that occupies our imagination for like the 3 days it's happening, and then it's forgotten. But there's something about the mundane and the everyday nature of this, even as it's quite, exotic at some level to have a tiger lurking in your, at the edge of your village glaring at you with anger. There's something about the texture that I think makes us understand this moment in time in a slightly different way. So the first reason I think these stories are important to listen to is because they narrate change. They narrate change in the environment, in social terms, in economic terms, in political terms, and they move us away from a more popular narrative. And I think that this, to me, this, when I would ask them saying, how do you see life in the Himalaya has become unlivable? Why do you not want to live here? Why is there such mass outmigration from this region? They don't say we're climate refugees. They don't say the glaciers is disappearing. They say actually, they will talk about that leopard, which they think has gone crooked, as they put it, there's something wrong with its behavior, which is coming and carrying the babies off, which is starving, it's coming into villages, it's coming into homes, it's attacking people in a way that they have never ever witnessed before. They talk about the anger that they can see resonating from non-human animals. So I'm talking about leopards and tigers here, but there's also a huge account of the Himalayan brown bear and the way these bears are going mad, as they call it. They're going mad with the heat up in the upper Himalaya and they're attacking humans in a sort of wanton way. They're coming and destroying farms, they're destroying households because they're so angry, and they're so angry at humans for what we have done. The second reason, I think, is really, I think that we need to pay attention to how people talk about big cats, predatory big cats in particular, is in the explanation for why big cats go crooked. And I think in these explanations, so again, I would ask them saying, why do you think this leopard is becoming a man-eater? Why is it coming and attacking you? The answers, to me, are extremely telling because of the kind of connections they forge, the ways in which a lot of these answers and these stories about why a specific tiger has gone crooked forges connections between colonialism, between capitalism. They talk about big industrialists who are coming and building these fume-spitting industries here, about how trees are being cut down, how the regular prey base has vanished because of poaching, because of wanton murder, because of the hatred that some people have towards non-humans, because of the commodification. They have languages to talk about it. They talk about the politics of the Indian state, the elitism and the exclusivist nature of conservationism. They're not talking about it through these terms, but they tell long stories around that. And I find it particularly telling the way in which capital enters these accounts in the form of named industrialists, like a big industrialist who's set up a big dam that has demolished that environment and completely killed so much, not just trees and the space, but also animals and displaced people, etc. So again, I think for me, these narratives draw really complex relationships. They make connections that perhaps are not so obvious, right? So one of the problems, again, which Fiona was also talking about with talking about the planetary crisis is that it asks us to forge connections between time, place, disciplines, ways of understanding the world, and it's really difficult to actually tie that together. this is why climate change is such a remarkably elusive object to talk about. As soon as we start moving out of a received narrative of, higher temperatures or melting glaciers or extinction. And I think these narratives do that work for us, and I think they do them very creatively, and they do it in a way that is much more alive and attuned, and it can sort of, I think, allow us to reimagine the world. And finally, and I'm going to end here, I think some of these stories around big cats from the Indian Himalaya also carry with them ideas of climate justice. They carry with them ideas of the kind of debts that are owed between species, that are owed across generations, that are owed by the rich and the poor, from the rich to the poor. And this, again, they're largely talking within the space of the nation state of India, but there are ways in which we can extend it further. And so I think that these stories have within them a deep sense of ethics, of multi-species justice, and they also have pretty profound imaginations of what it might mean to coexist and to live in harmony with one another in this moment of time. I'm going to end here, but I look forward to furthering this conversation after this. And after me comes Professor Amanda Parr.
Well, I'm a historian. I probably should have introduced myself at the beginning. I'm sorry about that. I was rather focused on what I was going to say. So I'm a medieval historian, and for a long time I was worried about climate change, but felt that there wasn't very much that I could say about it from a disciplinary perspective. And then I began to realize that that couldn't actually be more wrong, and that without medieval histories, this is a hard phenomenon to understand. That might seem like a claim that requires some justification, so I'll give you that justification. I think that, well, an idea that I don't really mean this, but something that I've kind of been playing with is the idea that historians are perhaps more responsible for climate crisis than most people, because of the stories that people who have told about the past over the millennia in different societies have shaped the way that societies not only think about what they've achieved, but they think about what they should be doing next. And so what the trajectory of their society is very grounded in the stories that historians have been telling. And I mean, I think that way of looking at it is probably one of the important first steps towards bedding climate crisis, climate change, environmental change into our sense of ourselves as people, but also into our sense of the importance of the stories that you tell about it. And I think one of the problems that we've been having over recent decades is that this has seemed a problem of the sciences. It's something that gets talked about in these phenomenally abstract terms. I mean, they're not actually abstract terms, but for most of us who are not scientists, if someone talks about CO2, it's a hard thing to think with. And we're not, most of us, trained to think with it. So how is it that we can talk about this and take responsibility for it in ways that we can understand? And part of the conception of putting this panel together was to pull disciplines that are really ordinary in terms of the culture in our societies. I'm telling stories, talking about the past. I'm thinking in terms of music of different kinds. This is very familiar. Everyone does it all the time. And if we can work out how to talk about these things in these subjects, then I think that that's a really important sort of step forwards to be able to grasp and think and inhabit the problem in very different ways. So coming back to the problem of historians and our responsibility for planetary crisis, I'm not talking here about all people's stories about the past or even all stories about the past. I'm talking about the sorts of stories that have been elevated to the dominant stories about the past in different societies. So that is to say the stories that serve the interests of the powerful, that hold societies together in the ways that the people who run the societies wish them to be held together. So the stories that are encoded by those who are given the privilege of being literate, the stories that are copied over the centuries, the stories that become part of people's education, the stories that become part of proclamations by rulers and the law and the whole way that the society is structured. There are lots of kind of quiet counter-revolutionary stories that get carried with these, and I think that's exciting for historians to explore as well. But there are these very sharp narratives that hold the status quo in place over the centuries. And they come with, you can find them back in the very earliest states if you look at the kind of stories that are told by the monumental architecture of ancient Assyrian empires, for example. They're not very dissimilar from the stories that we still, the we is a great problem. I don't have time to talk about the we properly, but we who subscribe to the modern westernizing, globalizing sense of progress, which, you know, is an awful lot of us, even if we try not to, it's sort of there as our default narrative. So these stories, these are stories about civilization, I suppose. These are stories about how something has been built by humans out of the wilderness, and how humans have progressed from whatever kind of beginnings imagined in various different mythologies, and how humans have, or these particular humans who've made the civilization have tamed nature, they've built cities, they grow the right kinds of crops, there's security for the population. Inside the cities are cultured, elegant people who display their wealth mostly through items that are pillaged from very distant ecosystems. And of course, the further away it comes from, the more impressive the display. These are stories in the service of war and slavery and domination, and these things are all harnessed together. And the promise to the people who are the recipients of the story is that you're secure because you live within this civilization. And the great threat to the civilization lies outside it. It's in the forests and the woods and the barbarian people that inhabit these untamed landscapes. And the responsibility of civilization is to spread the enlightenment of the civilization. So go to the dark corners of the world, enlighten it, and teach people to understand the single universal truth that this civilization is offering. I'm speaking in very general terms, but I think you can probably pinpoint the different forms of these ideas in societies that keep records. There are a lot of societies over these millennia that didn't keep records, that didn't do monumental architecture of any kind, that lived lightly and sustainably on the earth, and you can't see them, and we don't tell their histories because we don't know what they were. So we're sort of stuck with the histories of the people who were unsustainable and heavy on the earth, and glorified their transformation of landscapes in particular ways. So I think, first of all, if we recognize that our sense of both the past but also what comes next is really tied into these kinds of agendas, I think it's also helpful to recognize that these are the agendas of the powerful in these societies. In order to create an urbanized society with high culture, an awful lot of people need to spend their entire lives laboring in the fields without very much choice. Otherwise, you can't do it. Or maybe more recently you can. That's a whole other conversation. But essentially, civilization depends on a lack of freedom for a lot of people, and also for other than human life of many kinds, plants, animals. And it's also quite devastating often to non-life, to the mountains that get carved away to bring the stone and mined for minerals. And then the kind of the lead pollution that runs through the atmosphere as a consequence of the mining and the making coins and all the rest of it. So the more civilized you are, the more damaging you are in a way, but the less you're willing to acknowledge that in your story, and every bit of damage becomes more evidence of the success of civilization. So those are the stories that have predominated. What historians, I think, can do to help with climate crisis is to tell familiar stories very differently. I mean, in a way, I've kind of insinuated the difference around how I've been characterizing civilization. And one can do that a great deal more directly. It's a really exciting time for historians, actually, because the amount of data that's been generated by interdisciplinary teams led by scientists who are trying to understand how climate has changed has given us data on a scale and with a depth of detail and precision that historians have, could only dream of in the past, right from sort of micro-regional studies through to great studies of sort of solar cycles that run over centuries and shift temperatures and climates. So and this is something historians are a little bit nervous about, but also excited by. And so I think that's quite it gives a very different kind of richness of context for historical study, but also it enables us to trace consequences in a way of human actions, and anthropogenic effects on landscapes are nothing new. I mean, again, you can partly distinguish the existence of ancient states by this kind of study of what's happened to landscapes around those empires. Plato lamented the deforestation of the hills around Athens and the consequences of erosion. It's not new. So telling stories differently, I think, is a really important bit of this, so that we can see that climate change isn't, well, in a sense, catastrophic climate change of the sort that may happen is new, but inhabiting a world where the human imprint on the landscape is locally, if not catastrophic, certainly harmful. It changes environments, changes people, changes animals and plants. That's not new. We've been living in this all along. In a way, the difficult thing for us to imagine is not living in the world that's created the climate crisis. I think that I mean, in a way that this is a grim story, but in another way, I think it's helpful right now when we're having trouble understanding it well enough to take action at the necessary speed. Because I think we tend to see climate crisis as a rupture with, everything was going fine, humans were progressing nicely, and then suddenly someone's come along and said, yeah, we're going to have climate crisis now, we may all be extinct. That's shocking news. But I think if we start telling and knowing and being taught from an early age histories that have this as the obvious outcome of that way of living, I think that's a good basis for rethinking and for seeing that we must fast. So my third observation is that I think this problem that both Fiona and Annika have talked about in different ways of wrestling with how you imagine what we're talking about with climate crisis and how it seems beyond imagination. I think in one of the ways to pull it down from more CO2 in the atmosphere to something comprehensible is to think as individuals, and for our children and their children, nothing I think is going to happen to any individual that hasn't happened at some point in history. Now, this isn't comforting. History is full of awful, awful things, but we're not going to need to reach for new emotions. There aren't going to be losses that haven't, one experiences loss immediately and personally. It's, people one cares about. All these things are kind of there in the histories, and we've known how people have survived them or not survived them, how people have talked and thought about them afterwards, how that's affected what's happened next. We've got this vast kind of, I don't know, I hate the word, but a sort of database of experiences that happen when crops fail, or when it's too hot, or when it's too wet, or when a local ecosystem is damaged, what happens to the people who live there. We've got all that to think with, so we can again use the past to help us inhabit it, and I suppose also to give us hope if we can understand and move fast enough on our understanding of real things happening to real people as a history, not as an ivory tower discipline, but history as a way of accessing a real world that's being blocked by a refusal to face the reality of climate crisis. And I think, there are so many other things that I could say, but I'm probably pretty much out of time. I think maybe just one, as a medievalist, I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in that I just wanted to throw in as a final thought, one of the major elements in the kind of progress narrative of the Middle Ages is the conversion of the pagan population of Europe to Christianity, which then becomes the basis of the kingdoms of Europe, which then turn into the modern nation states. And so in this story, the pagans kind of live in the woods and they worship trees and streams, and that's all very backwards. And then the missionaries come along and they're converted to Christianity, and then they start becoming modern in various ways. But I think if we this is not particularly an observation about Christianity, but it's an observation about the way that Christianity is used in this period. When Christ is crucified, he rises from the dead, they open the tomb, there's no body there. He's risen entirely. He doesn't belong to the earth anymore. And right throughout the Middle Ages, there were lots of arguments and lots of thoughts about what happened to the body when it was resurrected. And the one thing that everyone agreed in is that it doesn't disintegrate into the earth permanently. The body's resurrected at the end. It's entirely, it leaves no atom of itself in the earth. It goes off to the stars separately. And there are, all over Christian countries in the Middle Ages, there are illustrations of the tombs opening on Judgment Day and the people coming out whole and entire, or being, if they've had a limb bitten off by a wolf, the wolf is kind of in the picture opening its mouth and the limbs coming back and rejoining the body. But this is a really kind of significant evacuation of relationships with the planet, which is kind of highlighted by also the sense that kind of pagan thing of being too close to trees and streams and particular trees and particular streams that had to be destroyed in order to liberate people to have this kind of transcendent worldview. I think that this is really deeply embedded in our rationality, and I just that we shouldn't care about the environment so much. We should be prepared to abandon close relationships with the Earth in order to just go somewhere else. And I mean, I think seeing everyone going into space just at the moment kind of underlines that point in a painfully literal way. But I just want to throw that in as a kind of slightly more concrete example of how looking at the past in particular ways can tell us stories that really help us understand what's going on now and which things we might want to unpick and think differently about. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and I'm really grateful to Nyanika and Fiona for the opportunity to be here as part of this panel. It's a real privilege for me to be amongst friends and colleagues and speaking about these topics. So actually, I'm going to pick up on some of the themes which Amanda has just been talking about, but with reference to one particular place, albeit a very, very big place. And I'm going to talk about, well, maybe not music, but sound. And I should say at the start that I don't really see a formal difference between music and sound. For me, they're part of the same thing, state of being. Hopefully that will become apparent as I say a little bit more. In 2018, in an article by a team led by Chappot, Astor, McGrath, Baker, Anthony, Gerstoff et al., published in the Geophysical Research Letters, that's the Journal of the American Geophysical Union, there are reports of observations of differences in the seismic hum of the Ross ice shelf in Antarctica in response to changes in weather patterns. In the lay summary at the head of the text, that's the bit I can understand, the article described how, quote, the shelf nearly continuously sings at frequencies of 5 or more cycles per second, excited by local and regional winds blowing across its snow dune-like topography. And the article went on to state that, quote, the frequencies and other features of this singing change, both as storms alter the snow dunes and during a January 2016 warming event that resulted in melting in the ice shelf's near surface. It's the end of the quotation. The conclusion of the article's research indicates that closer and more sustained attention to what we might call the singing patterns of the ice shelf, albeit at a level too low in frequency, the scientists tell us, to be audible to human ears, could provide early evidence of structural changes in the stability and composition of the ice shelf in response to larger patterns of climate change and global heating. Such changes could potentially signal the breakup and ultimately the collapse of the ice shelf itself. And in the wake of such an apocalyptic event, that singing ice might in effect become a global climatological swan song. The scale of the ice shelf is almost impossible to comprehend, encompassing an area of over 500,000 square kilometers, the size of France. The Ross ice shelf forms a colossal bulwark between the Ross Sea and the Transantarctic Mountains, holding back the passage of ice through huge glacier streams from the central plateau beyond, and scoured by katabatic winds blowing down from the plateau that can reach speeds of 300 kilometers an hour. Rising between 15 and 50 meters above mean water level, but with 90% of its mass below the surface of the sea, the shelf was responsible in March 2000 for carving the largest iceberg ever recorded, labeled prosaically B15, which measured 10,950 square kilometers alone, a huge portion of the shelf, and it's just a tiny fraction of its total area. Statistics alone, however, do not account for the ice shelf's significance. To early Antarctic explorers at the start of the 20th century, the shelf presented a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, the mystic barrier, as Norwegian Roald Amundsen termed it, which protected and concealed the as yet unseen mysteries of the land beyond. Yet the shelf's geographical location, arcing deeply into the body of the continent, also meant that it offered a strategic advantage, a platform that provided the closest access to the plateau and the pole beyond. It became the site then for the performance of the physical rituals of heroic struggle, scientific observation, imperial prospect, and endurance. For Amundsen, Ernest Shackleton, and Scott, the ice shelf embodied a notion of landscape and environment deeply shaped and formed by the imaginaries of colonial conquest and adventure. And I don't need to rehearse these at length, but it's worth us running through a few of those to get a sense of what it actually meant. For them, then, the ice was seemingly permanent, static, essentially unchanging, and immovable, albeit subject to seasonal change. It was, in essence, oppositional, indifferent, unthinking. And crucially, it offered a blank sheet, a white space that invited the projection of personal and national ambitions. The shelf, like the continent as a whole, signaled a deadening of perception and the terror of anonymity or abstraction, of erasure. It symbolized the ultimate denial of the bodily and the real, the formidable playing out of a particular colonial logic captured in the title of Herbert Ponting's cinematic treatment of Scott's 1913 British Antarctic expedition, which he called The Great White Silence. We could spend a long time unpacking that title. Even the name of Scott's vessel, the Terra Nova, is in retrospect highly revealing. The brave new world his ship sought to penetrate was, to his ideas, frigid, unyielding, and unspeaking. It was a voiceless and uncaring object, a nameless body. A century later, the work of Chapeau et al. Offers a very different account of the ice, no longer concerned with blankness, but rather with the widening of the sensory field, a dynamic acoustic matrix configured in terms of depth, scale, and flow. Listening to the singing of the ice, a new set of questions arises, pressing more urgently at the imperatives of climate change and the Anthropocene. Sound, rather than silence, emerges as the most vital medium for confronting and addressing these concerns. And as the ice sings, it also speaks. But why is sound so intrinsic to this keener, more holistic approach to the ice? My concern here is not so much with the materiality of seismic survey and observation, crucial though those issues are, but rather with the metaphorical work which sound performs. As Stephen Feld and Holly Watkins, among those have observed, it is precisely the way that sound folds together these notions of depth, scale, and flow, which can unlock a more meaningful approach to the ice shelf. Depth then can be heard in forms of resonance, amplitude, and sounding waves. It is felt in the acoustic trace of snow deposition, in patterns of friction and abrasion, in spectral peaks and troughs. And by spectral peaks, I mean the peaks of the spectral frequencies out of which sound is physically made. But I also intend the kind of ghostly metaphor too. Scale is likewise always double, both temporal and spatial. It figures the colossal extent of the ice, even in retreat. It responds to ice continents, seas, mass, or plateau, the global impact of the polar regime, the reach of the Humboldt Current, the circumpolar drift of the Antarctic, which governs the world's weather systems. At the same time, it can be infinitesimally small, minute, or microscopic, the granularity of the ice melt and its crystalline detail. Each ice crystal, of course, is uniquely formed and shaped. It's that fractal sense that a tiny change or shift in the world weather patterns can result in climate shifts of cataclysmic proportions far from the location of the ice shelf itself. Sound's role then is in mediating, but also blurring these boundaries of scale, proportion, order, and hierarchy. It renders the temporal and the spatial indistinguishable, prolonging space in time, but constantly also in the process of decay or fading away. And sound, like ice, flows. It channels, grooves, and tracks. It might be the sound of pouring water into moulins on the surface of the ice sheet of Karlsklits Nunars, Greenland. It might be the sound of glaciers carving into the bay. It might be a dynamic state of continual flux. It also becomes a model for understanding auditory perception. Stephen's pine image of a giant swirling Antarctic vortex becomes effectively a giant ear, the spiraling gyre like a cochlea, a huge continental recording and transmission device. But in reality, Chapotel's work offers something which indigenous First Nation knowledge in the northern circumpolar region has always known and recognised, namely that ice is fissile, contingent, dynamic, fluid, and mobile. Listening to the singing of the ice, then, is to endow environment with an agency of a kind which is profoundly non-human and whose motion speaks of spaces, timescales, durations, and processes that stretch and break our physical and affective boundaries and horizons. It sings of the long, erosive legacies of colonial ambition and the slow violence of globalization, of species loss and ecological degradation. But in its profoundly restless and unsettling ululations, this ice song demands a more disturbing but necessary interrogation. It asks, whose voice, whose time, whose place, and what happens when the ice sings no longer? Thank you.
Can I pick up on that? Because that's what I was struck by. I mean, thank you for being so nice about our papers to start with. But I think as soon as you start talking about the language of levers, it suggests that somehow you've got an engine driver and it's just a question of a bit of adjustment here and a bit of adjustment there. This is very problematic. I mean, this is actually playing into the idea of people who consider themselves in charge actually knowing what they're doing and being able to fix it. So it is rhetoric, exactly. And I think that is something that the arts and humanities can do, is to challenge those, those metaphors and say, well, why is it a lever? And I think very often the language of government can be problematic. Language of economics, talk about permanent growth, but never what happens when you go back to the roots of that metaphor, which is decay. That's just something, that gets edited out. So I think actually looking at a language of the discussions is really important. And I think it also leads to a different set of questions relating to language. And that is that I think a lot of the language that is used doesn't really kind of mean much. I mean, Amanda said how it's difficult to imagine CO2. I mean, we've heard an awful lot about CO2 lately, but actually to imagine what that means is quite hard for most people. And I think even words that if you're used to talking about climate change, you know what it means, biodiversity, food security. I think, lots of people who might be listening to the news, reading the paper or whatever, it doesn't mean anything. And that's why stories are so helpful. Nyanika's picture immediately speaks to people in a way that a lot of people, I think, just are a bit baffled by the jargon. And I think, the idea of a 1.5% rise in global temperatures or a 5% rise in global temperatures, for most people, if they're thinking about, there's some holiday or whatever, it kind of doesn't compute. So I think there are all kinds of problems with the language that is used for these discussions.
Perhaps we need to write a new lexicon for policymakers who actually want to make a difference, as opposed to policymakers who'd rather not.
I mean, I think if I could just add to what everyone's just saying, I think that's a really important question you've raised then. It's something that is put forward to, say, social scientists who work in this field a bit. So for instance, I was asked to give 3-point recommendations on how one saves tigers in India. And it's impossible, right? And actually, in a way, the entire corpus of sort of social science humanities work would say that these 3-point recommendations don't work. These technocratic fixes are the problem. You can't just devise a policy that will then save, that will prevent extinction. What we need is societal change. We need to change the language. We need to change the discourse. We need to think differently. We need sweeping, really radical changes in the way in which the state functions, the way in which capital operates, and so that is a really big problem. I completely, I think your point is so important because it is something that, I think the point Dan made is really important, that we have these conversations in these spaces. We try to shift the discourse a bit. But then again, when you come to these policymakers, they'll be like, but what do we do? Tell us, in the 6-page document, how we fix it. When as an anthropologist answers saying, well, that is the problem. It can't be done like that. There is an impasse that's reached, right? And I think that this is, again, something that we need to think about as academics, as humanities and social scientists, that how do we not translate our knowledge into something doable and 6 points that we can do, but how do we actually engage with policymakers or with states or with international organizations in a way that can shift the way in which they imagine they should effect change in the world. And I think it's a huge task, and it will take time, and I don't know whether we have the time. So this is a very depressing answer to your question, but I think it's a really important point you raised. I saw a hand up there. Amanda,
I just wanted to add one thing, which I think it's a challenge for all of us working in these fields, is about scale. So many of us have probably quite small scale impact projects because we've been encouraged to do that by the way that funding and research assessments worked over the last couple of decades. But how do you scale up? So rather than thinking, how can I put on, as a small event that captures a local audience, because that's how knowledge transfer has been imagined. How do we scale up? How do we produce ways of thinking and talking that can be used widely across society and resonate with all sorts of different groups rather than the people who come today? How do you talk to people who would never come, who aren't in the academic world? How I mean, the stories, I think, and the music and the art and these ways of grounding it are really important. But I wonder whether kind of fundamental to this scaling up is what we think climate change is. I mean, we think of it as something that scientists can explain to us and that can be solved with solutions. Maybe that's not at all what it is. Maybe it's, things kind of uneasily changing around us so that, my courgettes didn't work this summer. Things that people, that make, that are climate change, but are climate change that you're living day to day, wherever you live. And if we talk about it in these terms, but maybe in a way that's just slightly heightened so that it's interesting as well, because my courgettes failing isn't really that interesting, but there, a kind of a sense of a sort of shifting unease in the suburbs around outer Oxford as things change. Maybe that's a story. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Anybody want to add to the question of scale, like how we scale up this sort of?
I'll say two quick things. One is music's not a language. You can quote me on that. But that's its strength. And I think the other is that politicians, even when they're speaking from positions of power and authority, are also speaking from a position of defensiveness. And I think that we also need to understand that's partly what is determining the jargon that seems so inhumane and so resistant to engagement. Yeah. It's a defensive maneuver. Fiona started by talking about thinking and feeling, and I think that's exactly the right threshold, because it is about that haptic engagement with the world. And I think that's also what Amanda's been capturing through medieval narratives, is that sense for what does it feel like to have been there then, and recording that sense of that was the feeling. That's both a sort of internal human effect, the response to the rains were really bad this year, the river flooded, we were washed away, but also that feeling for the world around you, which one reads out of those sources as well. I think that's precisely what the visual and the sense of touch and smell and sound gives us. And I think it's that feelingness that we always need to put back into the equation.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree. I think, you mentioned the polar bear and the way in which, say, Greenpeace has marshaled the drowning polar bear, the affective nature of that image and how powerful that is a case in point, precisely as you said, a way in which you can marshal the visual and other forms to actually raise awareness, but also rethink what this moment in time means. Absolutely. So a really important comment to get in the visual, and also social media. You're so right about TikTok and Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media, TV, anything really. I don't think this is going to be a kind of one media kind of message. I mean, everybody needs to be talking about these things and challenging the sort of dominant narratives that Amanda's talking about, and it comes in all sorts of different ways. So I think the fact we weren't particularly talking about visual things is that we had 5 minutes each, and there's just so many different aspects to talk about. But yeah, I mean, thinking about David Attenborough programmes and the effect that, an image of a seabird feeding its chick, something plastic, had, compared with endless scientific papers. It's not that there's anything wrong with the science or anything, it's just that people respond, as Dan says, they feel some identification with that starving chick and that poor mummy seabird. So I think different images speak in different ways to different people, but it's very powerful. I agree completely.
It's a difficult question. I mean, yes, it might be one answer, but there's some very kind of biting criticism of the idea that having had such a destructive impact on Indigenous cultures around the world that we should now say, okay, well, we caused your apocalypses, now can you come and help us, please, because we're finally catching up with ourselves. And the kind of the crudeness, to put it mildly, of doing that. And sort of questions about whose stories you can turn to and whose stories are now unaffected. And I think that there is this, if we want to kind of find a sort of tenderness and a return to living in ecosystems, then there are stories that we can find that might help us do it. But the collection of essays edited by Anna Tsing and some others about the arts of living on a damaged planet, I mean, there's nothing pure to go back to, so these have got to be complicated stories. Donna Haraway, in Staying with the Trouble, towards the end of it, I don't know if people know this, but towards the end of it, she imagines some way of staying with the trouble, of kind of, and it's this sort of story going into the future of sort of generations of people who try to live in a radically different way and integrate their DNA with that of endangered species. And it's really kind of fabulous, strange, different kind of story, and maybe that, and there's a lot to think with there, even though it's obviously not meant to be exactly what we would do.
Yeah, I think one problem with the proposal to live in a radically different way, it can quite often involve, a desert island in inverted commas, or some, unspoilt land, as Amanda's saying, and that actually can just be a different sort of colonisation, of taking someone else's place. So I think there are all sorts of problems about it, and I think it can also very often seem a rather kind of privileged, idealistic thing, which for people who at the moment are struggling to feed their children, it may seem a little bit self-indulgent that you're imagining a different sort of lifestyle when they actually are thinking, right, I better go to the feed bank. So I think there are problems, and I think the whole kind of issue of sustainability and more sustainable lifestyles, like having a heat pump installed, it doesn't necessarily speak to people who are already kind of living from hand to mouth and finding, well, unless I'm paid at the end of the week, what are we all going to eat? So I think it needs to come in with a great deal of attention to social injustices as well, actually, and I think it always has done. And I can see these are very difficult things to reconcile. I mean, one of the things I am encouraged by is the move within business to more sustainable practice and a sense of profit that doesn't just mean lots of extra money for the stakeholders, but actually profit in a much broader sense, a more old-fashioned sense, if you like, of profiting communities and things. And that seems to me quite a step in the right direction. But I think we have to be, quite careful not to seem, especially for those of us who are fortunate enough to have a nice job in Oxford, to be telling other people that they ought to be living in this way, when actually that would just seem like the privilege speaking. So I think that's another thing we have to be mindful of as well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if you want me to talk about science fiction film soundtracks. I'm happy to do that. Or soundtracks for nature documentaries. Actually, what's interesting about those is how frequently they draw on some rather tired old tropes to do with hunt and pursuit or nature idyll. They're actually rather unreconstructed. So I think there's a lot to say about that's not really offering us an alternative. So I think more fruitful actually is thinking about the quotidian, the everyday, which is what Amanda was talking about. And I think we will get an alternative future from listening more carefully to what we've got around us.
And I think one of the really crucial recognitions that, that speaks to what you've been saying is that solutions or no solutions, we're living in this, we're already living in it. Some people are living in it an awful lot at the moment, others can see it coming. And how we live in it becomes really important. I mean, I think that one of the problems is that the different projections that we have for the rest of the century and how things might be like this or might be like that, and the emphasis that some scientists occasionally make on this is happening. It's how we act at any given point determines. There's not a sort of series of set futures, and I think that this gathers into it so much, and a lot of what you're talking about. So the kinds of choices that we make and the sort of ethics behind the choices and the ethics of everybody, and the things that are valued and how people treat each other as things become more difficult in different ways, that then leads to the next bit and the next bit and the shapes that it takes. And the worst case scenarios rely on probably the worst types of human ethics and behaviour to each other, and the better scenarios. And this is something I think is not yet well understood, but I think another important role for humanities and for lots of people is to build that sense that this is happening, and how it happens is sort of not even up for grabs as a zero something, but continuously how it happens and how we think within it and how we act within it. And that doesn't stop. It's not as if we can achieve the solution and then we don't need to worry about the ethics anymore.
Yeah, I think it's about being witness, and it's about testimony. So I think in some sense we're all historians, because that's what we are trying to capture, that knowledge of what it was like or what it is like, so that we can understand what is it going to be like. And I think that's the core of seems to me what the humanities continually bring, is that different sense of, but witness it this way, and this is the testimony of this person, that event, that object, that thing that happened. So I think the idea of a kind of truth and reconciliation process for climate, that's TRCs are very complex and problematic in all sorts of ways, but in some sense that's kind of what I imagine the humanities and the arts provide.
Yeah, and I think also just kind of very ancient ethical questions. That's what interested me. Just thinking about Paradise Lost for this evening. That when Adam discovers that what he needs to do is live well, that sounds very easy, but actually, it immediately raises the question: well, what does that mean? And that is something that people have been worrying about forever, and we should continue to be worrying about and debating, and I don't think it's got a very easy answer. And that's why discussions are so important, because this evening we've all been learning from each other. We may all kind of in a way be worried by the same things. We're coming from very different disciplines, and we're listening to each other, and that that's one of the things I like about working in university. You're constantly getting different points of view and having to kind of rethink your own, and so I think that's incredibly helpful, and I think that's what humanities discussion is really, really good at, and we can learn a lot from the moral philosophers from all different cultures, and think about it and be constantly testing what we inherit, as well as sort of thinking that it might have some answers. And I think that's terribly important, that kind of critical rethinking all the time, and never just sort of complacently thinking, right, we've got to the answer, all's well now. That's what I think the humanities is so important for. That is a really interesting question, and I think one of the difficulties people have with talking about climate change at all is that most people probably don't really want the ending. So they kind of fear the ending, whereas with most stories, they're sort of driven along, as you say, they're teleological, that Frank Commode says every tick wants its tock. You get moved along through the narrative because there's a sense of an ending, and there are kind of traditional endings that are satisfactory endings for stories. The obvious ones are kind of marriage or death, depending on whether it's a tragic narrative or a comic one. More sophisticated ones are more open-ended, but they have a sort of a rightness. And I think one of the things that's so difficult about climate change is that people, are kind of not wanting to move forward, and that's something that we're all having to deal with. So I think it's a really, really interesting question, and I think it's one I'd need to think a bit more about. But yeah, I think you actually put your finger on one of the central difficulties. And actually, an apocalyptic narrative, if you go for Clive an apocalyptic narrative, everybody's dead at the end. That's dead easy from an artistic point of view. I mean, what's much more difficult is thinking of something a little bit more nuanced or various. And again, that's another challenge to creative artists and writers and filmmakers at the moment, an exciting one actually. What different kinds of ending can we have?
I think you've also sort of really put your finger on, a trait of this moment, which is uncertainty. So we've talked about death and endings. We've talked about the difficulties of imagining a future, translation, language, metaphor, scale. But something perhaps we haven't touched enough about in this panel quite yet is this sense of uncertainty, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen quite literally tomorrow. We don't know how do you write a future when you have no understanding of what that might be. So partly it's, as you're saying, Fiona, just a future in which everyone's dead, everyone's drowned, or the glaciers have all like melted and we're all dead. That's not really an ending. I mean, that's not a great ending. It's not a happy ending, but it's, as you said, dead easy.
Well, it's a way of not thinking about it, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's actually quite it's a bit of a cop-out, I think.
It's
actually
a non-story. It's a non-narrative, right? And I think so I think part of the challenge, the way I see it, is to actually be able to write that uncertainty into the story. So we have questions of translation. We have a very important point that you made about the linear narrative or the teleological ending that is often there, especially in academic writing. So fiction, I think, is able to play with it a bit more. But academic writing, you expect a narrative, right? You expect a question, you expect a body to it, and you expect some sort of conclusion. But I think for me, I see this as a challenge to actually the way in which we write, that there is no certainty to your arguments, that a lot of it is speculative, a lot of it is uncertain, a lot of it is you're drawing on different sources and you're trying to make sense of a situation that's actually, we don't quite have the language for yet. Forget the narrative, we don't have the words for it, we don't have the lexicon for it, in a way, but we still do it. So it also means abandoning our writing practices, I think, or the ways in which we think and construct knowledge. Not entirely abandoning them, as Fiona has beautifully shown, with going back to, say, Milton and rereading Milton, or thinking about, B15 and the sound that B15 makes. But finding new ways to talk about the world, whether it's the past, the present, the future. And I think that's really hard. I mean, it's incredibly challenging. And I think, again, like to come back to the original point of why did we have people from different disciplines sitting here, is because I think we're all struggling with this question in different ways, right? Yeah, and I think it's a big challenge in this moment for all of us. So for policymakers, of course, to construct policies that do something. But for us as academics, to write in a way that can take on both that uncertainty.
I'm also just thinking about the huge efforts that many people working in the sciences have gone to over decades to try and figure out what's going on and how to talk about it. And we've been a bit idle, possibly, in the humanities and socials, or some of the social sciences. But if we think about a sort of comparable effort to develop the conceptual and tools and the tools of language and thinking that we need.
Yeah.
Well, I think with uncertainty comes curiosity and playfulness. And I think that might be the way in which we push back against the apocalyptic or the eschatological is.
That's right.
Actually, it's through curiosity, it's through that sense of play that you re-engage and you revitalise and you understand in different ways and you begin to transform.
Might be worth saying one of the podcasts is called Accelerating Political Change. I haven't heard it yet, but I'd be very interested to hear what. And that's the kind of overwhelming question: how do you connect the feeling of the population with how they act politically and what's available politically?
I also wonder whether, I don't know whether this isn't an old, quote-unquote, an older problem too, right? That if you think of, say, the old work, now it seems old, but like the work on development or critiques of development or of, say, IMF policies, etc. There's always been this critical scholarship that has existed and said, no, these policies are problematic for this reason, or, and they haven't necessarily translated across domains. I mean, I think it just feels so much more apocalyptic in this moment because the stakes feel so much higher. But I also wonder whether the stakes aren't higher because this is affecting all of us and not just, people in certain impoverished parts of the world. So I wonder whether, this isn't also at some level, it's a very new question, but it's also an old question of power. To go back to a point that was sort of being made
I wonder
earlier.
also if your question's about leadership. And I've been thinking about leadership a lot recently. And
Interim director.
I think part of what you're expressing is frustration with a certain kind of managerialism, which is always very sort of operational, delivery oriented. I just don't think it works when we've got something as messy and as complicated, to use Fiona's phrase, as climate change. So I think it needs a different kind of leadership. And I would like to think that musicians have a different sense of leadership sometimes, because it's about a kind of ensemble working together and responding to these sort of random variables that you then get from around you, and thinking and feeling, those words again. And I think that's a more appropriate model for the kind of leadership we might need here, one that's more acoustically attuned, but also plugged into other sensory responses. And I think that perhaps is the challenge for our current leaders, is plug your senses back in.